You step outside for a break. You cup your hands around a small flame and pull smoke into your lungs on purpose. It feels like a modern habit. A lighter, a pack, 5 minutes stolen from a busy day. But the real answer to when this started is far stranger than a habit picked up in a smoky bar. It reaches back past cities, past farming, past the wheel. It reaches into the last ice age, to a desert that no longer exists. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists assumed smoking was young, a few thousand years old at most. Tobacco pipes showed up in the record, nicotine residue turned up in ceramics, and the story seemed settled. Then, in 2021, a team led by archaeologist Darren Duke published a discovery that rewrote the timeline entirely. At a site called Wishbone in Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert, Duke's team excavated an ancient hearth. Inside it, they found 4 charred seeds. Tiny. Almost nothing to look at. But under analysis, those seeds turned out to be wild tobacco, a species called Nicotiana attenuata. The hearth was 12,300 years old. That is not a typo. 12,300 years. 9,000 years earlier than any previous evidence of humans touching tobacco. The people who left those seeds behind were hunter-gatherers living at the edge of an ice age lake in a world with mammoths still walking somewhere nearby, and they were already reaching for a plant that made their minds feel different. Before Duke's discovery, the oldest confirmed evidence came from a very different place. Ceramic pipes recovered in Alabama, roughly 3,000 years old, still carried faint traces of nicotine deep in their pores. For decades, that was the accepted starting line. 3,000 years felt old enough. It made smoking a Bronze Age habit, something tied to settled village life, to pottery, to people who stayed in one place long enough to fire clay. The wishbone seeds destroyed that assumption in a single afternoon of lab work. These weren't villagers. They were nomadic foragers, moving with the seasons, carrying almost nothing they didn't need. And somewhere in their kit, tucked in with the tools for hunting and fire starting, was a plant they had already learned to use with intention. Why? That's the question that actually matters here, not when. Why? The seeds don't tell you exactly how the plant was used. No pipe was found, no burnt bowl, no charred stem clutched in a fossilized hand. Researchers suspect the leaves were twisted, chewed, or sucked, and the seeds were simply spit out near the fire. It wasn't smoking, not in the way you'd picture it. It was something rougher, a leaf pressed against the gums, a stem worked between the teeth, a small, deliberate act of altering how the body felt in thousands of years before anyone wrote a word down. Here's where it gets stranger. This wasn't an isolated event. It wasn't one curious forager trying something once and never again. Fast forward almost 12,000 years to the Columbia Plateau in the Pacific Northwest. In 2018, a researcher named Shannon Tushingham led a study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, examining ancient stone pipes recovered from that region. Her team used biomolecular analysis, essentially chemical testing, sensitive enough to detect trace residues invisible to the naked eye, to figure out exactly what people had been smoking inside pipes that were over 1,000 years old. The results surprised everyone. Long before European contact, before commercial tobacco arrived from the south, indigenous communities on the plateau were smoking a completely different plant. Not tobacco. Something else entirely. A native plant used specifically for its psychoactive effect. Only later did tobacco replace it as the dominant smoking plant in the region. Think about what that means. Smoking wasn't one invention, spreading outward from a single origin point, like a rumor passed hand to hand. It was independently discovered, refined, and swapped out for better options, over and over, across different peoples, different continents, different plants. Humans weren't smoking because someone showed them how. They were smoking because something in the behavior kept getting reinvented. That pattern should stop you for a second. Independent invention is rare in human history. Most technologies spread through contact, trade, migration, one group learning from another, but smoking shows up again and again in places with no contact at all, separated by oceans and thousands of years. When completely unconnected groups of people keep arriving at the same behavior on their own, that's usually a sign the behavior is answering a need that isn't cultural. It's biological. So what was that something? This is the part that reframes everything. You'd assume ancient tobacco use was recreational, the Ice Age equivalent of a cigarette break. But a growing body of research suggests the earliest motivations weren't about pleasure at all. They were about survival. In 2014, researchers Casey Roulette and Edward Hagen studied a population of Central African foragers called the AKA. The AKA smoke tobacco heavily, and they also carry a heavy burden of intestinal parasites, worms living inside their digestive tracts, with essentially no access to modern medicine to treat them. Roulette and Hagen tested something specific. When AKA smokers were given medication to clear those parasites, their nicotine intake dropped, measured through cotinine levels in their saliva. The implication is remarkable. Nicotine is toxic to intestinal worms. It's a plant's own chemical defense system, evolved to poison the animals trying to eat it. Somewhere in deep human history, people may have discovered that consuming small, controlled doses of that toxin helped fight off internal parasites that were making them sick. Not a vice. A medicine. A form of self-medication that predates the entire concept of a pharmacy by tens of thousands of years. There's a wider pattern behind this, one that stretches beyond humans entirely. Biologists have documented parasitized caterpillars deliberately increasing their intake of toxic plants, almost as if dosing themselves against infection. Chimpanzees in the wild swallow certain rough, bitter leaves whole, leaves with no nutritional value, apparently to scrape parasites out of their gut. If other species reach for toxic plants when something inside them is wrong, it isn't such a leap to think early humans, watching their own bodies and the animals around them, learn to do the same thing on purpose, which reframes the entire picture one more time. This wasn't a plant that happened to feel good, discovered by accident and kept around for pleasure. This was closer to trial and error medicine, passed down the same way fire starting or flint knapping was passed down. Knowledge, tested on the body, worth remembering. But medicine wasn't the only reason the behavior survived. In 2025, a research team led by John Rick and Daniel Contreras published findings from Chavin de Huantar, a ceremonial site high in the Peruvian Andes built nearly 3,000 years ago. Buried inside the site's stone galleries, the team found a hidden chamber. Inside it, snuff tubes carved from hollow bird bones, small enough to fit in a closed hand. Chemical analysis found nicotine from wild tobacco relatives, along with residue from vilca, a hallucinogenic bean chemically related to DMT. Here's the part that reframes everything again. This wasn't a plant shared freely around a communal fire. The chamber was small, hidden, deliberately hard to reach. Rick and Contreras argue that access to it was restricted to a narrow circle of elites. In other words, somewhere around 3,000 years ago, the same plants that may have started as a parasite medicine had already been converted into something else entirely, a tool of power. Whoever controlled the mysterious, mind-altering ritual controlled a kind of authority ordinary people couldn't question, because they couldn't access the experience themselves. Medicine, ritual, now social control. The same handful of plant chemicals doing 3 completely different jobs on 3 different continents across thousands of years. Your body doesn't know the difference between old and new. It responds to the same chemical the same way it did 12,000 years ago. Nicotine crosses into your bloodstream, reaches your brain in about 10 seconds, and triggers a flood of dopamine. That's the same reward pathway that once reinforced eating when you were starving, or resting when you were exhausted. Ancient foragers weren't wired any differently than you are. When they found a plant that reliably calmed the body, dulled the gut, or numbed a low-grade parasitic misery they had no other way to treat, their brains rewarded that discovery the exact same way yours does now. And that reward system doesn't stay flat. It adapts. Use a plant like this often enough, and your brain quietly recalibrates around it, building more receptors to soak up the flood, expecting the dose before it even arrives. Miss the dose, and the body notices immediately. Irritability, a dip in focus, a low hum of unease that only resolves once the chemical shows back up. None of that machinery was built for cigarettes. It was built tens of thousands of years earlier, for a world where the plants worth craving were rare, useful, and worth remembering the location of. Your brain still runs that ancient program, even though almost nothing about your environment resembles the one it was written for. That's the twist worth sitting with. The habit didn't start as an escape from stress. It may have started as a defense against literal, physical parasites, an evolutionary tool disguised as a bad habit long before anyone called it one. Of course, over thousands of years, the medicine and the ritual and the pleasure all blurred together. You can't cleanly separate them anymore. And honestly, the people living through it probably couldn't either. A plant that dulls a parasite's grip on your gut also happens to calm your nerves. A plant that calms your nerves also happens to feel worth sharing around a fire with people you trust. Worth offering to a god or a spirit or whatever unseen force you believed was listening. One use quietly grew into three. And once that discovery was made, it didn't stay still. It traveled, it adapted. Different regions found different plants that did something similar. Some communities used wild tobacco, others used the plant Tushingham's team identified on the plateau. Betel nut use appears in the archaeological record in the Philippines almost as far back as tobacco in the Americas, showing up as a stain on ancient teeth. Across separate continents, separate peoples, separate plants, the same basic behavior kept reappearing. Put something into your body, change how you feel, repeat. Somewhere along the way, the plant itself changed too. The tobacco chewed at Wishbone was wild, small-leafed, low in nicotine compared to what came later. Over thousands of years, as farming spread through the Americas, people began cultivating tobacco deliberately, the same way they cultivated maize or beans, selecting the plants with more potent leaves, replanting their seeds, breeding a wild survival plant, generation by generation, into something stronger, more reliable, more concentrated. By the time European explorers encountered tobacco in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast in the 15th century, they weren't looking at the same modest wild leaf hunter-gatherers had once chewed beside a hearth. They were looking at a domesticated crop, thousands of years in the making, carrying far more of the chemical that had made it worth cultivating in the first place. That domestication is the hinge point of the entire story. It's the moment a plant humans had used cautiously, in small doses, for medicine and ritual, became something closer to a commodity. Something that could be grown in rows, dried in bulk, traded across oceans. The instinct behind it was 12,000 years old. The scale it reached within a few centuries was entirely new. By the time you get to recorded history, the ritual side of the behavior had taken over almost completely. Tobacco became sacred among many indigenous cultures of the Americas. Smoked in ceremonies, offered to the earth, used to mark agreements between people. The plant that may have started as medicine became a bridge, something that connected the living to the spiritual, the individual to the group. Smoke rising into the air was thought to carry a message somewhere, a prayer with a physical form. The Maya took this even further. In 2012, researchers analyzing a miniature ceramic flask from a late classic Maya site in Guatemala, dated to roughly AD 600 to 900, found something nobody expected: residue from liquid tobacco. Not smoked, drunk. The flask had been recovered near an ancient sweat bath, a space tied to healing and purification rituals. Researchers now believe the Maya sometimes drank concentrated tobacco liquid to induce trance states, to communicate with ancestors and gods, and, in the darker rituals of the period, to dull pain before human sacrifice. Picture that for a second. A plant discovered by hungry, cold hunter-gatherers in an Ice Age desert, chewed for reasons that may have been entirely medical, ends up nearly 10,000 years later inside a temple, poured down someone's throat to open a door to another world. The chemistry never changed. Nicotine is nicotine. What changed was the story humans wrapped around it. None of that ritual meaning existed for the people at Wishbone 12,000 years ago, chewing a bitter leaf beside a hearth in the desert. For them, it might have simply worked. It made something feel less wrong. And your brain still runs on the same basic circuitry that made that feeling worth repeating. Think about what you actually reach for when your body feels off, or your mind won't settle. Coffee for the fog, a drink for the tension, a cigarette for the restlessness that shows up around 4 in the afternoon when the day has worn you down and nothing has technically gone wrong yet. None of these urges arrived with instructions. They arrived because some ancient version of the same circuitry rewarded a plant that fixed a problem. Once, a very long time ago, and your brain never forgot the shortcut. Public health researchers today talk about nicotine addiction almost entirely in terms of harm. That framing is accurate. Modern tobacco, industrially processed and inhaled through burning paper hundreds of times a day, causes real damage that a chewed wild leaf beside an Ice Age hearth never could. But the framing also hides the plant's original context. Nobody at Wishbone was addicted in the way you'd recognize today. They were experimenting cautiously with something that worked on a body very much like yours. What changed wasn't the plant. It was the dose, the frequency, and the delivery system. A hunter-gatherer chewing a leaf a few times a season is not the same as a body absorbing nicotine dozens of times a day, every day, for decades, from a product engineered to maximize how much of it reaches the brain and how fast. Somewhere between a wild leaf at an Ice Age hearth and a factory-rolled cigarette, an ancient survival tool was scaled up far past anything the body evolved to handle. The instinct stayed exactly the same size. The plant around it didn't. That's the part that should sit uncomfortably with you. You step outside, light something, and breathe it in during a stressful afternoon. And you probably think of it as a purely modern coping mechanism, something invented by anxiety and marketing and the pace of contemporary life. But the underlying instinct, reaching for a plant that changes how your body feels when something feels off, is not modern at all. It is one of the oldest, most repeated behaviors your species has ever practiced. Right now, more than 1 billion people on the planet smoke. That number is almost impossible to picture, so try this instead. It means roughly 1 in 8 people you will ever see in your life. Statistically, reaches for the same basic act that a hunter-gatherer at the edge of an Ice Age lake reached for first. Different plant, different packaging, same circuitry. Public health campaigns frame that number as a crisis, and in terms of modern health outcomes, it is one. But it's worth remembering that the number exists at all because the underlying behavior worked at some point for someone badly enough that it got remembered, refined, and passed down for 12,000 years before anyone thought to put it in a box with a warning label on the side. You didn't inherit a bad habit from a factory or an advertisement. You inherited a survival strategy from a hunter-gatherer standing at the edge of an Ice Age lake who found a leaf that made the body feel different and decided that was worth doing again. There's one more detail worth sitting with before you go. Almost none of the uses this video covered happened alone. The seeds at Wishbone were found in a shared hearth. The pipes on the Columbia Plateau were passed between people. The snuff tubes at Chavin were used inside a chamber built for more than one person to enter. Even the Maya flask was found near a communal sweat bath. Whatever this plant did chemically, it did something socially just as powerful. It gave people a reason to sit close together, in the dark, sharing something that changed how they felt at the exact same moment. That, too, might be part of why the habit never disappeared. It wasn't only medicine. It wasn't only ritual. It was one of the oldest excuses your species ever found to stay near the fire, together, a little longer. You step outside for a break. You cup your hands around a small flame. And without realizing it, you're repeating an act that is not a habit at all, but one of the oldest conversations your species has ever had with the natural world.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.